Hello, everybody. Welcome to another video. Today it is 18th of January, and today's standout headline when it comes to frontline advances is the Russian advance into the core of Chasiv Yar, entering some of the high-rise buildings in the southern parts of that core part of the city. And so a lot of the video will be dedicated to discussing that advance. In addition, there is some movement around the Turets region. But if you guys look at the timestamps, you'll see that by the end of the video, I dedicate really a large portion of time to discussing recent policy changes enacted by Zelensky. And what I'm referring to is the fact that now there is an order to stop creating new brigades. There was this entire scheme that really Zelensky was a big proponent of back in the later stages of 2023, creating 15 new brigades. That was the idea that they would be NATO trained and given a lot of NATO equipment. And you could see that really exemplified with the story of the 155th Mechanized Brigade, which I discussed in an earlier video, which I can link in the description for you guys. And of course, since then, there has been a process rolled out that the brigades between the series 140 to 160 were created. A lot of them did end up getting Western training to varying extents. In a lot of cases, parts of the brigades were trained externally, and parts really never received the necessary basic training from the NATO camp, let alone from the Ukrainian internal training, and then were sent to the front line. And so that was a big part of the AFU's structure during the 2024 period when they really were looking to get additional recruits with the passing of the new mobilization law that lowered the age from 27 to 25. And now there are renewed discussions due to pressure that could be coming from the Trump administration that's coming in the next few days to lower the age of mobilization even further down from 25, which it has been instituted at since I think April, and potentially to 23, 21. On the really radical end, they would be 18, but those are discussions that are now in their initial phases. But regardless of that, we're going to look in detail at also the scandal related to a lot of qualified Air Force technicians being called up to actually serve in infantry roles instead of having their designation continued as operators within the Ukrainian Air Force when they're desperately needed for certain air command tasks. And now we'll also look at the reversal of that potential call up due to really the entire drama unfolding about a week ago. So now we have hindsight on our side, and we could give this sort of sobering view of the situation to all of you. But let's zoom in and look at the recent developments. I want to begin just by mentioning something that is occurring around the Pokrovsk front, even though I don't have much of an update from this region when it comes to frontline changes. There are a lot of murmurs about the next Ukrainian moves in this region from the command structure. And so you can see how there is this Beek River. I haven't really discussed it much because it was not within the purview of the front line, but now it's really reaching that point. So you can see on the border between Donetsk and Dnipro, you have this village Kamyanka. Then there's this sort of lower lying valley with a chain of villages attached to it that expands all the way southeastwards to the approaches of Pokrovsk. So this is the entire Beek River Valley. It is a low-lying area that the Ukrainians have been building up defenses for several months now, especially from, I think it's the 31st Engineering Regiment. So you could see over here how there are all of these localized strongholds that could also be connected together over the next couple of weeks. There is potential for expansion over here, not just along this semicircle specifically, but also to encompass the entire border between Donetsk and Dnipro. So you can see the border over here, and I'll zoom out very slightly so you guys can understand what I'm referring to. But in light blue, these are the anti-tank ditches. In yellow, those are where you have the trenches and dugouts that are also pretty fleshed out now. And so you can see how they were built in a way to sort of encompass the border region, and it could still be expanded to a certain degree in areas like this over here. But you can see over here, basically running along the entire municipal lines, you have this just massive anti-tank ditch. And it's reaching the point where it's about to be connected with the trenches that are located just south of the Beek River Valley. So there is a very clear Ukrainian contingency plan for a potential loss of Pokrovsk, but not just Pokrovsk, but also, say, all of the open fields and very few sparsely populated villages like Strahivka that are located to the west, which would be in this area over here that I'm going over with the next. And these are areas that, from the Ukrainian perspective, they're pretty difficult to maintain in the sense that they are on lower elevation. There are not a lot of trenches over there. As you can see, it is just entirely an open area. So the Ukrainians are already in the process of preparing for a general withdrawal from this location. I don't know when that will happen. I think that it would depend on the ongoing battles in Udachina and Kotlina, because those are the final two populated areas where there really are clashes right now, and also the potential vitality of some, preliminary fallback lines before going all the way up north of the Beek River, because there really would be a large withdrawal, because it is right now 15 kilometers away from the line of contact. You very rarely see just a willing choice to withdraw in such a drastic way. And so there are a few lines in between that the Ukrainians probably will be trying to drag their feet in before eventually consolidating over this line, which will happen at some point. But you could see, first of all, that the Serhivka Pokrovsk line is a possibility, because then there will be a retention of the E50 highway, which is absolutely critical to the supply of the city of Pokrovsk. Pokrovsk itself has 5 roads leading into it. One of them has already been cut off by the Russian side, and or 3 of the others, sorry, they are within the range of most Russian FPV drones. So 10-kilometer range, and now with the new fiber optic FPV drones that are being readily adopted by the Russian side over here, the range is expanded to between 15 to 20 kilometers. And that means basically everything coming into this city is under constant threat, but there are varying degrees. And so the least affected would be this road that comes from Dobropilia to the north all the way to Pokrovsk. But besides that, this other road is pretty important because it connects to the Dnipro region into cities, I think, like Pavlohrad and Dnipro, all the way to the west along the river. And so this road is very important to protect physically. But by the point that the line of contact would reach basically Serhivka and Pokrovsk, it would be extremely close to the line of contact, making it very difficult to use as a supply artery. But regardless, the Ukrainians would want to try to hold out and drag out fighting here for as long as possible in order to prevent a large-scale flanking operation onto the city of Pokrovsk itself. But I do expect that at some point this will become the front line. And then the next step would be a gradual withdrawal of the Ukrainians to their actual prayer defenses. And it's sort of similar to the Vovcha River, where in the Ukrainians, they really banked on using that body of water and that geographic defense to hold out. And really, they took advantage of that geographic defense to accompany that with a lot of fortresses that were sort of connected together in other places not, but really built around points that could be used if the Russians were to cross over the river. The thing is, it wasn't able to encompass the entirety of the river line. And so, in the one area where there was a gap, especially in an area where the infantry was lacking and was not able to uphold their defensive duties, that one region that was not actually well fortified, that's where the entire line ended up collapsing. And so, it's going to be important this time for the Ukrainians not to repeat the same mistake, and to ensure that basically all their gaps are closed, both when it comes to static defenses, but also when it comes to the deployment of various units to those regions. And this will have even more important implications, because you're already at the point where there aren't that many prepared defenses to the west. You're already looking at reaching into the countryside of the Dnipro region, or looking northwards to another key city like Dobropilia, which is now going to become one of those really important rear nodes that isn't really far away from the front line, but could still be considered rear. Right now, it's about I don't know, 25 kilometers away from the front line, and it serves a pretty similar role to what Pokrovsk served a couple of months ago before it entered the realm of fighting. So that's something to keep in mind as we move forward. But when we look at the minutia of the clashes over here, the Russians are in Kotline. They are in this mine facility. I think it's called Mine Shaft Number 2. You can see the industrial area, which is a part of the wider Pokrovsk coke plant production facility. It includes these power drivers, the electrical substation, factories, and they are connected to various tunnel systems. And so, what's being reported by New York Times and by also local Ukrainian media is that not only in this location, but in other areas where there are these coke production shafts, the Ukrainians really worked tooth and nail to keep maintenance and to keep production for as long as possible, just dragging it out up until the very last moment when the Russians were basically just approaching it at the footsteps of these facilities. But as they were continuing to work, they also rigged the mine shafts with explosives in order to make them untenable for future Russian flanking operations, because there was a fear that the Russian forces could then utilize, say, the tunnels over there to pop up on the Ukrainian rear in certain regions and then create issues on their flanks. And so something that happened, for instance, in the Pischano region is that the mine over here and the accompanying shafts were destroyed by the Ukrainian side. And something similar could have already happened or will eventually happen with this shaft over here that is currently enduring fierce clashes. And same thing with the one near Udachnia. There's also another mine shaft, I believe, that is called Donbass number 3, and Donetsk number 3 is actually a coal mine. And so it's another one of these really important production facilities that is still under Ukrainian hands, one of the largest ones in this entire region, but one that they are, of course, taking the necessary steps to prepare for in the case that the Russians end up reaching that region. In order to make it untenable for any offensive use in the future. Now, the issue is now that the Ukrainians are destroying it and that they're retreating from these regions, they're losing one of their really major economic outlets, because the production of coke needed for, of course, steel manufacturing, that's Ukraine's second largest export behind agriculture. And so now they're losing essentially their largest facility in the entire country, and production could drop by between 50 to 60% or even more due to the loss of this one facility. And it's not just one shaft, there's a couple of them, but they're all connected together in the same general region, and all of them are falling into Russian hands. And so now it's going to be important from an economic outlook, because we're looking at billions of dollars being lost because it can't then be utilized for Ukrainian economic growth. Looking for ways to diversify the amount of production in various other facilities and increasing production, or at least alleviating the losses that are currently going to be experienced in order to not endure any sort of shortfalls in the near future. So let's move on to the clashes that are going on in Toretsk over here. You could see that there just was a slight advance into Novospaske. I'm going to click on the geolocation. There was a Voron FPV strike. Voron group, a part of the 100th Mechanized Brigade. The FPV destroyed a Russian loaf vehicle. This van made it all the way to the line of contact, to a really difficult part of the clashes. But nonetheless, they utilized it, even though it is just wholly unprepared for enduring a direct hit by an FPV. And it was, of course, destroyed in the process. But it does also indicate that the Russians are continuing to push over here and have been able to just make slight gains deeper into the village itself. Looking at Chasiv Yar, this is what I really want to focus on today. You can see that the Russian forces have been able to infiltrate into the core of the city, and they did through one of the areas that is least dense in relative terms, because could you imagine the Russians launching an armored assault directly through the refractory plants? That would be pretty difficult. And then also running through this line of duplexes in larger apartments. So what they ended up doing is going through the areas they already have control over and can project organization and strength through, because you have over here the Kalinina micro district, which is turned into a large Russian organization point. And then from there, you could cross over the canal and send in armored vehicles through this main road into the core of Chasiv Yar. So that's what they did. They, of course, have control over the Novi district and the Oktyabrski district. And from there, they use it as a launch pad to, take over this relatively small piece of territory. But it is significant because now they have this foothold within the most dense area in the city. And what happens over here is it's from the 24th Mechanized Brigade. It's from today. It shows just FPV strikes, artillery shelling, targeting two Russian BMD-4Ms, obviously a part of the 98th VDV division. And they were entering into this apartment complex. And the results of the video are unclear. So for now, there is this ambiguity in the potential that the Russians were actually able to dismount forces and deploy into some of these apartment buildings, meaning that they have a necessary base and foundation in order to expand even deeper and get control over more high rises, reach the city hospital, and from there also flank the rest of the core of the city, which includes shopping mall, I think, or shopping facility of some sort, rail station, and then the refractory. And when it comes to the refractory, you can see that there are still Ukrainians located over here. The 215th Recon Battalion of the 98th VDV Division, they released footage yesterday shelling the Chasiv Yar plant, and the geolocation proves that they're still located in this region. So I made a map adjustment to reflect that fact. But again, this is another point now that even though the situation has sort of stabilized on the northern flank of Chasiv Yar, now you're beginning to see the core of the city sort of being chipped away at. And it's going to be important to see how long the Ukrainians can hold, or if they can conduct localized counterattacks to just reduce the pressure somewhat. But so far, we haven't seen any reinforcements come into this city. So that's also pretty interesting. And looking just to the north, I want to look at this region over here, just to the east of Zeleny High. So on the general Oskil River front, the Russians have been able to advance over the past couple of weeks and capture 6.4 square kilometers of territory. I just didn't mention it. But you can see over here that on January 4th, the 3rd Assault Brigade, it's deployed over here. They conduct strikes on a dugout containing Russian soldiers in this location. And then along a tree line that runs to the east of the town, the 44th Brigade, another pretty important unit for this region, they conducted FPV strikes onto Russian soldiers advancing through that forested region. But for now, Zeleny High holds, and it is an important village to retain control over because the loss of it would give the Russians the foothold needed to reach the first line of trenches. There are two lines of trenches protecting Borva, which is basically the largest city under their control, besides Kupiansk to the east of the Oskil River. And now they are almost at the gates of the first line of defense. And after that, it's not much before reaching the second line. So right now they're only about 3-4 kilometers away from that those trenches. And once you cross over that line of defenses, you really only have two populated areas to think about: Borivska, Andrivka, and Shikivka. Looking to the north, the Russians have uh, in Kolesnikivka, there are conflicting reports because, based on a geolocation from January, there was a Ukrainian armored counterattack into the northern portion of the village along the main road from Lhushkivka. But then some Russian sources contended that the armored attack was repelled and that they were able to reestablish themselves within this polygon of zero point 0.8 square kilometers. For now, keeping it under Ukrainian control, but it is important that the Ukrainians keep this sort of foothold. They don't have to take the entirety of the village, but just having that northern entrance point secured, it prevents the Russians from then further expanding with their offensive capabilities to reach the other villages running northwards along this main road all the way to Kupiansk. For now, it keeps the Russians at bay. The fact that the fighting is relegated to that one region. Also, around Tikha, the Russians have been able to re-enter for the first time, I think, since like July of 2024, just in the beginning months of the Vovchansk operation. So they captured over here zero point 0.9 square kilometers of territory, and have been able to enter some of the northernmost houses in that village. But it is more so a positional advance. And in the Kursk region, we have just some miscellaneous footage to go over. So 47th Mechanized Brigade, they conducted a localized counterattack just to the southwest of Viktorovka, an area that I have always marked as under Ukrainian control, but it appears that there was a recent Russian attempt over the past week to establish themselves in these tree lines located just to the southwest of the village, and that the 47th Brigade was deployed to this region utilizing tanks and armored support to dismount, of course, utilize the tanks to fire directly onto the Russian forces deployed in this region and then push them out. So for now, there is enough of a buffer to maintain control over Viktorovka and the nearby villages, but it is very, very narrow in the grand scheme of things. You also have the fact that the Russians recently conducted armored assaults near the border between Kursk and Sumy. In the process, they captured 2 square kilometers of territory, but there were attempts to foray into the Ukrainian side of the border, and those were quickly pushed back by the 67th Brigade, which is deployed in this region, which is a reformed brigade. As we talked about in an earlier video, it's just been completely restructured in terms of its officer corps, and now it's been deployed away from the Luhansk region to the Kursk area, and so their responsibility is preventing infiltrations into Sumy along this sort of western flank. And so far, they've done that by destroying some of the Russian columns, but some of the vehicles they destroyed are also abandoned Ukrainian vehicles. So keep that in mind. Now, when it comes to the story that I wanted to mention at the beginning of the video, so Zelensky recently, so the Ukrainian military journalist Yuri Bitosov, he said on January 10th that Zelensky, he decided that none of the newly raised troops for 2025 are going to be used for the creation of new combat units. Now, I don't know if that means that older forces could be used for new combat brigades, but really the answer is probably not. What we are going to see, and it's already been implemented in certain cases this year, is that units that are smaller in the sense that there may be battalions that are independent or regiments that are independent, like the Scala assault regiment. It was previously a battalion, but now just a couple of days ago, it was promoted to being a regiment, meaning it has two battalions. So that's where you're going to see expansion in already created units that are small but have some sort of proof that they have been successful in frontline combat. Those ones are going to receive new investment and new expansion. But totally new units, really, that's going to be put on the back burner because really there has been an excessive creation of them over the past year and a half. And what exemplifies that the most is the 155th Mechanized Brigade, as we talked about previously, and the issues highlighted by the Ukrainian side, and especially at the headquarters of the Supreme Commander in Chief when Zelensky was there. He basically had the rationale that there was an inexperience of commanders, and creating a whole new officer cast for every single unit is pretty difficult, that they received poor training, the new recruits. And the thing is, a lot of the recruits there actually were some certain degree experienced. And so those ones, they at the very least did not have to worry about training. But the new recruits that were coming in without any combat experience, or only combat experience, or military experience, I should say, of a year, and maybe they served the year like 10 years ago, those people, they didn't receive adequate training either in Europe or in Ukraine. And even despite the fact that there were some Western shipments, there were still issues with low equipment and with low manpower, just due to the fact that there was cannibalization of these units. Whenever they were deployed to the front line, they were split up by already experienced units that desperately needed the manpower, and then basically taken under the tutelage of those units. A lot of the specialized operators that actually were trained were taken by those experienced units, and same thing with the equipment accompanying it. So all those issues really compounded, made it very difficult for the unit to act as a unified force. Another issue, and this was raised by the commander of the 108th Mechanized Battalion, which is a really good unit, which has proven itself on the battlefield, especially at the moment in the Kharkiv region. He wrote an article recently for the Kiev Independent where he laid out the issues with creating new brigades, and he said that the new officer corps that were created for these brigades that have been formed over the past couple of months, that they are made up of reserve officers, officers that didn't even have combat roles in a previous experience, and also these officers that in earlier clashes, earlier battles, they didn't exemplify what was needed in order to be leaders, and they just had a pretty bad track record. And that's because the Ukrainians, they have deficits of new officers that actually are up for the job, and so then that's when you need to fill the vacuum. The standards begin to get lowered. And that's just a huge issue because it's sort of like a systematic top-down issue. Because then, when the training is bad, when the command is bad, and the trustworthiness is lacking, that's when you begin to see more people desert, and that's when the AWOL rates increase. And so that's why you have this issue that since the beginning of the war, there have been 90,000 cases opened by the Ukrainian prosecutor service for either desertions or going AWOL. And there's a huge difference, by the way. I don't want people to mix them up, because people that actually desert, they have zero intention of coming back. But people that go AWOL, there is a possibility that under better conditions or some sort of amnesty, they are willing to return. And so the numbers, I believe, between January to October of 2024, there were 20,000 cases of desertion from the Ukrainian military. Only 3% of them left the charges. So that's extremely small. And it's probably an issue of catching them in the first place. And then just the backlog once they make it in. And 1.3% of them made it to court. So again, that's a huge amount of forces that, if they get captured, that could get sent back to the front line. But we're talking about deserters, and there's a difference between that and people that go AWOL. So there are 42,000 cases from the period of January to October of 24 that were unauthorized absences, and 13% of those led to charges, and 7% of them actually led to them being sent to court. And that's not even talking about convictions, which is probably even lower. But regardless of that, I think it was late November. That's when there was a general amnesty given to every single Ukrainian that went AWOL for the first time. So first-time offenders, they have the possibility, or they at least had it throughout December, to return back to their units and then resolve their issues. And then all the AWOL cases that they had would be expunged from their record. And so that led to, I believe, in the month of November, and only November, 8,000 Ukrainian soldiers returning to the ranks. And that's not even including December. and even now January. But at this point, the policy has ended. So whoever didn't return by the New Year's, they're not going to have the record expunged. But there are still efforts to try to get back the people that are AWOL, because the AWOL issue is directly tied to the creation of new brigades and issues with leadership and proper equipment and supports. Now, when it comes to the Air Force scandal, it's been known since mid 2024 in the spring period that Sirski he wanted to move 5,000 men from the Ukraine Air Force into the ranks of the armed forces of Ukraine. And usually, what happens is those forces get added into the same units. It could be that due to the fact that it would be 5,000, that they would also be included in other elements. But usually, they're moved to the 1st Air Force Combined Rifles Brigade. And the Russians actually have a similar analog from the Russian Air Force, the VKS, where they actually turn into a motor rifle regiment. So the Russians have their own sort of version of this. But on the Ukrainian side, the issue is that there were 35,000 members of the Air Force in 2022. I don't know how much it is now after a lot of the movements that have occurred recently to ground combat. But the plan was by Sirski to recruit 5,000 men. And throughout the past couple of months, there have been these calling up orders, and there was not a public stir about it, but it did lead to, in many cases, forces, whether it be like maintenance crews or various support roles within the Air Force, having diminishing amounts of manpower, losing 50% of their actual beginning number. And it could go down to as low as 40% with the latest round of call ups made up by the Ukrainian military to send these forces into infantry roles. Initially, Ukrainian media actually reported the Air Force received orders to transfer technical personnel and anti-air gunners to infantry, and a lot of this came from the 114th Tactical Aviation Brigade. So they're responsible for a lot of the MiG-29s that you guys see out there. And I want to try to locate them on the map if I'm lucky enough to remember their specific location. And so you can see them over here. They already in the spring period had to let go of 250 of their recruits, and these are actually really experienced technicians, aviation technicians that are needed for proper maintenance of these really complicated systems. And now they're getting orders, or as of like 10 days ago, and now I don't know the status of it, but they were supposed to hand over another 218 technicians, meaning that the vast majority of their initial forces would be moved away, and then it would be basically impossible to maintain a lot of these airframes. The same sort of orders were given to anti aircraft forces, for radio engineering units, for surface to air missile operators, and a lot of them were trained abroad. And think about the investment of that. It takes years and millions of dollars to train a lot of these forces, only for them to end up in the same position as just anybody who just gets mobilized. So initially, based on the reporting that I read, it was planned for 200 men to be taken away from 8 different units, and that would be at least 1,600 men. And that's in addition to the hundreds that have already been taken throughout the second half of 2024. But this would be from one air surveillance brigade, from 3 tactical aviation brigades, and from 4 anti-air missile brigades. And a lot of them move specifically to the 152nd Mechanized Brigade, which is one of those donor units that basically gets cannibalized and taken over by other units, and split up for whatever purposes those units see fit. And so 150 technicians were sent to the brigades between the period of October to November 2024, and the plan was to train them in reserve and then deploy them in a gradual manner. But they were very quickly gobbled up by other units and then transferred to key parts of the front line, where the majority of them were either killed or wounded during the upcoming or the succeeding periods. So, following this outrage from a lot of the media and the public, the Ukrainian general staff, they clarified and said that highly specialized men like aircraft engineers, they would not be shuffled around, they would not be deployed into infantry roles, and also those that learned about Western technology abroad, really important people like gunners that deal with shooting down Shahed drones or cruise missiles. And a lot of them operating with these anti-air weapons, they would not be transferred either, because their work is extremely critical, and it takes like 3 years to train an aircraft technician when it comes to like the engineering side of it. And so then imagine how long it would take to train somebody else that would have to fill the void of whatever people that are currently trained have to go through and endure like frontline combat instead. And this was basically a reversal of the latest orders from Sierski on January 11th. And so now what's going to happen is there will still be members of the Air Force deployed and moved over to the 1st Rifles Brigade over here, but they will not be highly specialized. They'll basically be periphery individuals. Basically, the people that are least important within the Air Force will be moved there gradually over time. And there will be a particular emphasis on not taking away people that are needed for maintenance of Air Force. But even when it comes to anti-air crews, usually they were groups of five. You had usually five people, but now due to all of those crews being chopped up and taken over into fighting, it's been reduced to a minimum of three, which is extremely difficult because even those groups of five, like you read every single person, it's absolutely critical for the functioning of that sort of squad because you have the person that's operating the man pads, one operating the machine gun, person behind the flashlight or the thermal imaging. You have imagery, you have the communication team, you have the driver, so like all of them have to work in sync. But now it's been reduced to three, and that makes it harder to, repel a lot of these large-scale Russian ballistic missile, cruise missile, drone assaults. And if they have to be further chopped up, then these crews are just going to get disbanded. And so that's the issue with also taking away from the anti-air groups. And now, hopefully, from the Ukrainian perspective, they're looking at getting another 160,000 recruits over the next period of time. I don't know what was specified. It could be over the next year, this 2025 period, or it could be less than that. But that's the goal. Because right now, for the Ukrainian side, they're recruiting between 5 to 6,000 on a monthly basis, whereas the Russians are recruiting 20 to 30,000. So you could see that there's a significant mismatch already, and then it's compounded every single month due to the lack of new recruits being brought in. And to a certain degree, it has to do with the age limits, but not entirely, because we discussed what happened with the AWOL and the fact that people haven't been called up yet. And so there could be, regardless of what happens with the mobilization age, a new just uptick in the enforcement of call ups in order to reach that 160K mark, which would bring it to 13K per month that will be mobilized. But even that would not be enough to match up with the Russian side. And so you'd have to basically take the current rates, which is 5 to 6K, and then add it with the additional 13K for the Ukrainian plan for this year of mobilizing 13K per year. And then it would be pretty close to achieving parity. So really a monumental task. And I want to see how serious the Ukrainians are about implementing that. And so that's all for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.